recommendations for themselves or for people they think would like to contribute who are in our community. And finally, if you're not going to be able to make it, but you would like your vote to count, then you can register a proxy using our website, ruby.org.au, and I will pass it back to the others.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, guys. All right. I think we are recording now. Ah, there's some thumbs up. Some people who know more about Zoom have thumbs up. So that's your official, this is being recorded words. It will probably be put on the internet, the YouTube channel, to be precise. Would anybody like to talk about hiring? Perhaps if you would like to talk about hiring, if you're from Envato, we'll leave a bit of a space. Culture Amp.
As far as I'm aware, Culture Amp is still currently looking for a director of engineering focused on machine learning, a senior full stack software engineer, and a software engineer. So if you are interested in learning more about those roles, you can head to cultureamp.com/careers. Also feel free to message me, Nick Wolf, on the Ruby AU Slack, and I will thank you, Ryan, who's posted the link in the Zoom chat, or feel free to reach out to me on the Ruby AU Slack, and I will put you in touch with the people who are currently looking at our applications at the moment. Obviously, this is fluctuating circumstances, so I'm aware that that may influence what we are looking to hire in the short term.
Thank you, Nick. Anybody from Twilio? Anybody from Up?
Zendesk?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think we're looking for, I'm not entirely sure if these are related to Ruby, but we're looking for senior machine learning engineers. We're looking for a couple of staff software engineers, staff operations engineer, architects, and a team lead as well. So if you go onto the Zendesk website and search under Melbourne and engineering, you'll see all the available roles at the moment too. So we are doing remote interviews. So whatever jobs are open are still being hired for.
Thank you, Linda. Anybody not from our sponsors who is currently hiring? That feels...
I will just say REA is hiring for a bunch of roles, but similar to what Nick was saying, it is a little bit in flux at the moment, but they have like 60 empty roles. So if you're looking, good place to look.
Speaking of, would anybody like to talk about getting hired? Why is that funny? I don't know. Okay. Seals just laughed right out off camera. Apparently it wasn't anything I said, so it's fine. Anybody? Think we're okay? In that case, it's time for us to hand over to Pat.
Yay. Let me just set up the screen sharing then so you can see my slides. Where are we? That, there. Do your thing. Okay. Where's my cursor? There's my, oh, this. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. This is all a bit of an experiment, really. Your faces are over there on my other display, but my script is here, which matches the camera. So I'll be looking at you even though I can't see you all. But good evening, everyone. Is this all coming through fine? We can see the slide. Yes, lots of thumbs up. Fantastic. Yeah, this is something a little different to normal Melbourne Ruby events, but I'm sure it's all going to work out. it's been going wonderfully thus far. For those who have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Pat Allan. I have been working with Ruby for quite some time. If you do come to the meets in person, you've probably seen me around. I am in Melbourne, and I would like to note that I live and work on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples, part of the Eastern Kulin Nations. Like Celia and Vanessa, I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all elders of communities that are here on this call. We are here this evening to discuss both community and technology, and it's important to understand that this area that at least many of us are on, what many know as Melbourne, but has also been known as NARM for much longer than that. It has been home to community and technologists for tens of thousands of years, even though much of that history has sadly been destroyed. And there's still so much to learn from First Nations people and culture. So my slide has the word Womenjika, which in the Woiwurrung language of this land that I'm on means welcome. It also means to come with purpose. And I presume most of you have come along tonight with the purpose of learning, which is great. But even if your purpose is just to have some distraction from all the chaos that we're all grappling with right now, that's completely fine as well. It's lovely to have you all here. So this evening, I'm going to talk through how to write Ruby gems. And given the medium for this discussion, I've got a couple of requests, most of which I think you've already doing anyway, so it's going to be pretty damn easy. Essentially, can you keep your microphones muted to avoid any background noises? And I can see from the list that's what you're all doing anyway. Wonderful. Just helps me focus a little better. I will pause at several places in my presentation for questions because it's a decent length talk. And so when we do pause, you can use the raise hand icon at the bottom of the participants list. And that way I can see you've got a question and I'll call on you at those points and you can unmute, ask the question, and then I'll answer, and then we can mute again and continue on. Yeah. And we'll see how that goes. So that's the logistical challenges out of the way, so we can get stuck into gems. Now, you may well be asking, what actually is a gem? Which is a very fair question, but it also raises the issue of terminology, because there's a couple of overloaded terms that I'm going to be discussing. So let's start with the word gem itself. So this is perhaps the most common definition, especially for those not so familiar with programming. A gem being a precious stone. But for anyone who codes with Ruby, you've probably at least heard of the concept of a gem in other ways, right? And so the main way is where a gem is a collection of code written in Ruby with a given purpose of some sort. Right, so there are gems that deal with statistics. There are gems that deal with authentication, searching, generating PDFs, interacting with the APIs, and so on. There are gems for not quite everything, but a lot of things. But just to add a touch of confusion, there's also the command line tool to use in your terminal, which is called gem as well. And it is part of the Ruby Gems package manager, which is the other confusing term, Ruby Gems, because it is a package manager, which it's a way of installing packages of code, the gems, onto your machine. It also handles publishing of gems, of different versions of gems, and removing them and other such things. But Ruby Gems is also the name of the website that stores all the published versions of gems, which is similar but slightly different. They actually existed as separate things for a while. I think they're mostly the same thing now. And I'm hoping as I go through this talk, the context of what gem and what Ruby Gems I'm referring to is clear. If it's not, please do ask me to clarify. I have been writing Ruby and Gems a long time, so I can quite easily get lost in the lingo without realizing it. And I'm aware that not everyone, that's not the case for everyone. So yeah, feel free to call me out on that as we go. Any questions right now from anyone using the raised hand button? Not seeing any hands. Cool. We'll continue on. So that was a bit about what a gem is and some of the terminology. So why would you create a gem is the next bit. Firstly, if you've written some code and it does one thing quite well, excellent, and maybe you want to use that code in other projects, well, it's the perfect candidate for a gem. It's something you can package up quite neatly and use it elsewhere. And gems are mostly quite easy to install. So that makes it even easier to use across different projects. And not only can you use them across your different projects, gems can be installed and used by others. So you get, yeah, it becomes a great way of sharing code. All the gems we use have been shared with us, and it's a nice way of giving back and letting other people build on your hard work as you've built on top of theirs. So that's what and why, but really what I'm here to talk about is how. How do you create a gem? It's the main focus of tonight. Now, if a gem is just a collection of code, that's fine, but it's a little overwhelming. Where do you even start? What ties it all together? And the answer is the file called the gem spec. It provides the specification, the spec, for a gem, hence the name. It details what files are in the gem, what version it is, who built it, and what it depends on. And the file extension is literally .gemspec. So if we were going to create a gem for this evening, and we decide to call it melb_ruby, then you would probably name the file, the gemspec, melb_ruby.gemspec. As to what goes inside, well, it's going to look something like this. These are the initial core settings. Now, don't feel you need to parse that entire file right now. We're going to step through each setting one by one. So first up, the name of the gem. Probably kind of obvious that you'd want that in there. And then the current version of the gem, the author or authors and their email addresses. And then you want a summary of what the gem does. Try and keep it brief and to the point. Ideally, you want a homepage for your gem. And if you don't have a fancy whatever homepage, custom something or other, that's fine. Just put the GitHub repo in there. It's a great place to start. It's what most gems do. Plus a license. Now, I think MIT is a fine default here. I recognize there are a lot of opinions about licenses and probably just as many licenses to go with each opinion. And I'm not going to deal with that at all in this talk because this talk is too long already. But yeah, besides the license stuff, how are people feeling about all this? Any questions right now? Nope. Okay, we'll continue on. Further along in the gem spec, there are settings around where to find different files. Before we get stuck into those settings, I want to take a slight step back. Now, if you've used Rails before, which I presume most of you have, but maybe not all, and that's fine. In Rails, you understand that there are expected locations for different types of files, and that those conventions create a shared understanding of how everything works together. So models go in app models, controllers, views, assets, all these things have their correct, proper location. And gems don't quite have such enforced conventions. But there are some defaults that have emerged and some common community approaches. So really what you probably want to do is put everything in a folder that's the same name as your gem. It's not essential, but it does help when you're trying to find it later. So we're continuing on with the example of melb-ruby. You'd create that directory, and then inside that you'd create a folder called lib, which is short for library. And this is where the code for your actual gem goes. This is where all the logic and pretty much everything. Lib is the default location. You can change it. Don't. I'll show you the setting later, but again, you don't need to change it. There's no good reason I've come across ever to change it. I'm sure there are good reasons somewhere, but certainly if you're starting out, don't change it. Put it in lib. Now, if your gem has command line executables, like the Rails gem has the Rails command that you type into a terminal, and rspec the same, rake is another one. So those command line tools go in the, well, they can go in whichever directory you want, but I recommend they go in the exe directory, exe, short for executables. There is also a bin directory, and historically that's where a lot of those command line executables have gone. These days, I see more of a pattern around local development commands ending up in bin, like bin stubs for gems that you're using to work on the gem. That's confusing, but yeah, so they end up in bin. And if none of that is making much sense to you right now, don't sweat it. If you are writing a gem, you probably don't have any executables. Most gems don't. So you wouldn't have either of these directories. It's completely fine. You will hopefully have tests for your gem. So you put that in the folder that matches what your testing library uses. So if you're using rspec, put it in spec. If you're using test unit or mini test in the test directory. And then, yeah, you'll want a README. So you can write out how people use your gem and how to install it and how to update it. And that can be written really just to help yourself later on, 6 months down the track. But it also helps anybody else who might want to use your gem. And for the same reason, having a changelog is recommended. In that, you'd write out what versions have been released, when, yeah, and showing what you might need to change in your usage of the gem to upgrade. Not essential, definitely recommended. Okay, so back within that gem spec, this is how we would connect those things up. And we'll step through again each bit. So the files option is an array of all the files that you need to run your gem. So this is everything in lib. It's also potentially anything in exe. Doesn't need to be anything from your tests because you shouldn't require your tests to run the gem. I've hard coded it in this example. It's nicer to automate so you don't need to constantly change your gem spec every time you add a new file. And yes, the talk is being recorded. Sorry, I just saw that message. And I'll put these slides up online afterwards as well. Yeah, so instead of specifying the files one by one, we'll automate that. I'll show you in a moment how to do that. This is where if you were using a file that wasn't lib, you could change it. Again, don't, unless you have a really good reason. And even then, you probably don't. For executables, you need to specify the directory that they live in, which, as discussed before, is probably going to be exe. And then you need to list all the executables within that you want to ship as part of your gem. And it's just the name of the file. It's not the full path. It's just the name of the file that lives in that exe directory. So here I'm saying, yeah, we've got a command line tool called Melburnian. You're welcome to come up with your own examples, of course. Okay, so to avoid hard coding it, now this code here, Brendan, sorry, you've got a question. What's up?
Why do you need to have a manual list of all the files in the gem?
Because you may have other things in that directory that you don't want to send out as part of your gem. So test files. In the past, I've had a gem that has a really large test fixture file, like a massive CSV. I don't really want to send a 10 meg CSV out to everyone who's installing my gem. That's not fair on them. You may have to-do files in there. You may have other bits and pieces. Yeah, that's essentially why. Is that clear?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Yeah, so this code here, look, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to me, at least. But essentially what it does is saying, hey, give me all the files that are committed to Git for my gem repo, ignore all the test ones, and add everything else to the gem. And that's pretty neat. And yes, the code is kind of hard to understand, but at least you don't need to change it every single time you're adding or removing files to your gem. It just happens automatically. So that's great. Similarly, here's an example for specifying the executables. And what this does is it actually uses that previous command of all the files available, limits it to just the exe ones, and then adds them in without the directory structure. So again, you don't need to keep changing that later on. It's all done for you in one go. Okay. One of the eternally difficult parts of writing a gem, or writing any code really, but especially when you're writing gems, is naming things. It's really hard. I struggle. And even when it comes to writing a gem, what do you call your gem? What kind of name should you give it? And often that somebody else has already written a gem with that name, so you need to think of something else. I probably stress about this a little more than most people. And I can't tell you what to name your gem, unfortunately, but there's still some useful conventions to note. So this guideline here using underscores between words, it hasn't been applied all that well historically, because these are just guidelines and they've come later than gems themselves, right? So people have written all manner of gems and named them all different ways. And then some people in the community have gone, hey, maybe we could try and be consistent. So the general recommendations are using underscores between each word for a single concept. And that is maybe better explained with an example. So if we've got a gem called Melb Ruby, then as a Ruby constant, a class or a module, it would be written like this: capital M, capital R, no spaces. One concept really, this meter. So as a class, we'd name it like this. But if you're translating that to a gem name, then it becomes all lowercase with an underscore between the words. Still that single concept. Now, if you've got kind of separated concepts or name spacing really, then hyphens, dashes, whatever you want to call them, they're the way to go. Again, an example, there's a gem called rspec Rails. And it's making use of rspec, but it's also specifically about Rails. So two separate concepts here, hence the name spacing. And as a Ruby class or a constant, it's written like so: rspec : Rails. As a gem name, because they're separate concepts, you'd use a hyphen between the words. Now, that is mostly fine. When you start combining the two, it's not so ideal, not so clean. So let's say we had a separate gem called Melb Ruby Burgers, right? Because we have our Ruby Burgers meet as part of all the Melbourne events, which hopefully will return to normal after the lockdown. And so two separate concepts here, Melb Ruby Burgers, but you translate that to a gem name. Yeah, Melb _Ruby -burgers. I find that a little unclean, but yeah. I also find it very rare that you'd actually need to name a gem like that. So make of that what you will. The third recommendation around naming is to ensure that the file structure, and this is probably the most important of the three, you make sure that the file structure matches the gem name. and all the constants within. So some examples which we'll step through. Melbourne Ruby or Melb Ruby. Melb_Ruby is the name of the gem. So it goes under the lib directory, melb_ruby.rb. That is pretty easy. Now, if you're namespacing within that, then create the directory and put it under that. Excuse me. So melb_ruby/burgers.rb in this example. Other constants that are namespaced, same deal. Hacknight here, 2 words, 1 concept, put an underscore in. But beyond that, the same deal. Lives under lib, melb_ruby, hacknight.rb. And the reason I make this point is because what I don't want you to do is do something like this. Say you've got melb_ruby burgers as a constant, don't put it in lib burgers. I understand that the node constant matches there, burgers.rb, but if someone else has written a gem called burgers, it's also going to have a file lib/burgers.rb. And when you go to use both gems at the same time, Ruby won't know which file to require. It'll get confused. It won't complain, it'll just require one of them. And whatever rules it defines to choose the first, that's the one it gets. So yeah, anything within your gem should be namespaced in a folder structure within your gem name, just to avoid any conflicts. Now, executables. If you're building an executable file, you'd probably make it look something like this. You've got the shebang line at the top. You're acquiring in from code that lives in the lib directory, and then you're using that code. And really, it should ideally be something this simple. Right? You want the logic of what your executable is doing to actually live within lib. Keep the executable file itself really simple. Now, I did say shebang line. Some of you probably have no idea what that is, which is fair. It's a little bit obscure. It's this line here. And it's, at least my understanding, is that it's called the shebang line because of the first 2 characters, the hash, sh, and the exclamation mark, or bang, shebang. And its purpose is to tell your operating system how to interpret the file, or what to use to interpret the file. So in this case, we're telling it, hey, use Ruby for this file. Different languages, different shebang lines at the top. I'm being very high level in that information there. I'm sure many experienced developers are like, yeah, but also, or this, or that. Yeah, I know. I'm just keeping it simple for now. Okay, so if we've got an executable, you need to name it. So if we've got Melburnian as an executable, it would live in the exe directory, and it would not have a file extension, right? Because essentially, whatever the file name is what you invoke on the terminal. So you don't type rails.rb generate migration, blah, blah, blah. You just type rails, not rails.rb. And it's the same deal here. So it is a bit odd to have files with no extensions, but for executables, that's the deal. You'll also need to tell the operating system that it is an executable, that it's essentially a program rather than just a file to read and write. And so you'll need to run this command. Now this is for Mac and Linux. I'm not quite sure what the Windows equivalent is, I'm afraid. Chmod +X, the +X is a way of saying, hey, this is executable. Yeah, I don't quite know what chmod stands for, change modification something. I wouldn't worry too much about that. But it is a good point to pause for any questions, if anyone's got them. No questions, that's fine. We'll continue on. Change mode, that sounds right. Thanks, Kirsten. I mean, it's a good as guess as any. Maybe it's not a guess, it's just you ended with a question mark, so I'm not sure. I can't tell you if it's right, more to the point.
It is change mode, yep.
Cool, thanks, Josh. All right. We'll keep rolling. So there's one other essential part of the gem spec that we haven't yet covered that I want to go through, and that's dependencies. And dependencies are where you're saying, my gem needs these other gems to work. And there's two different ways of doing that. There are runtime dependencies, and these are the gems that your gem needs. No questions asked. It needs these to do its job. They are essential. And then there are development dependencies, and these are ones more that you're using to work on the gem. So testing libraries like rspec or rake, if you're using that to do some automation around working on the gem. But these are development dependencies are not required by other people using your gem. They don't get installed at that point. And in the gem spec, you'd set it up something like this. And you can have as many of these lines as you need. And you specify the gems, and then you specify the versions required. And getting the version numbers or constraints correct is really hard, I'll be honest. Some gems change super fast in ways that break usage, and others don't. So it's going to vary a bit depending on the gem and your experience with them. I would err towards being more relaxed than less, because if you're saying, hey, my gem works with Rails 5.1.4, and that's great until Rails 5.1.5 is released. And then do you need to release a new version of your gem that has the more relaxed dependency to allow that, or you don't really want to make those changes all the time? So you just say, hey, my gem requires Rails 5, or maybe 5 or better, even more relaxed. So there's a whole lot of nuance there. I won't talk any more about it, but certainly if you've got questions around that afterwards, feel free to hit me up on Slack or whatever, particularly if you've got specific examples. Okay, so that's everything that goes in the gem spec. And maybe you've written all your code, you've written some tests, wonderful. You've got a gem, what do you do with it? Well, you need to build it. You need to package it all up into a single file. And that file has a .gem prefix. And that's usually with the gem name and then a dash and then the current version, the version that you've packaged up into that file. For those who care, it's a glorified tar file, but that doesn't really matter. We just need to build it. And to do that, you run the gem build command. So we're in our terminal, we're using the gem command line tool for this gem build, and then you give it the path to your gem spec. And it will validate that gem spec and then package up all those files into this .gem file for you in the directory that you just ran the command. And that's great. And then you can install that gem if you want. I mean, you've already got the code in your machine, so that's fine. But gem install and then the path to that specific gem file does the job. Now, if you want other people to use it, which would be nice, you need to publish it. And that means putting it usually on rubygems.org. And for that, well, you need an account on there. It's free, pretty easy to set up. Just jump in there, do that. Also, you only need an account there if you're publishing gems. So if you're not doing that, don't worry about an account. And then you run this command, gem push, and then the path to the gem file that you've just generated. And that will ask you for your credentials for rubygems.org if you've not run the command already. And then it'll send that file up to their servers. And then after that, anyone can just run gem install melb-ruby, and they'll get the gem. Wonderful. Now, once you've published that gem version, it's locked in. And that is to ensure a consistent experience, right? Because you don't want to say, oh, this is Rails 601. And then 5 days later, they decide, actually, no, Rails 601 is going to be this other thing. That's not helpful to anyone. So yeah, once it's published, it's done, it's fixed. You cannot change it. If you've got bugs, congratulations, you're a real developer. and you'll need to release a new version of the gem. And that's the same deal you'll need to go through for any new features as well. You can remove gem versions, but don't really. The command is called yanking, gem yank, and it's generally not recommended because, yeah, we all write bugs. That doesn't mean we delete all the code we've ever written, right? And people may have installed a gem somewhere and you don't want to remove their ability to get it again, if just to get it and then upgrade to a new version after that. You would only yank a gem if it's doing something seriously bad, if it's somehow removing other files on the machine or logging passwords or whatever. And some people, unfortunately, publish very nefarious gems out there if they get somebody else's credentials and what have you. But generally that doesn't happen, and rubygems.org is constantly looking at ways of securing that, which is great. They have multi-factor authentication, which should totally enable if you're publishing gems. But yeah, you can delete them, don't. All right, that is a lot to take in. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, that's completely fair. And maybe you've got questions, but just, I want to cover one more thing first. And this is going to make it all much easier. So Bundler, which is a gem we almost all certainly use, has the ability to generate a gem for you. This is like generating a new Rails app. All that boilerplate code done automatically. It sets up the directory structure, it sets up the gem spec. It's great. So instead of creating all that by hand, just use Bundler. And how do you do that? You run bundle, gem, and then the name of the new gem you want to create. It gives you everything. Wonderful. It also gives you a rake task called release, which does all those gem commands. So the gem build, the gem push commands, does that for you. It tags your Git repo with the current version number. Yeah, it's really handy. I have been creating gems for over a decade. I'm older than I wish I was. I don't know. And yeah, this is the way I do it. I just use rake release. It works very well. The Bundler team have done a great job, and it's just one command. So I highly recommend it. Certainly, if you've been doing gems your own way for a long time, great. You keep doing that. That's completely fine. But otherwise, just use Bundler. I can see Colby's on the call, and he's done a lot of hard work on Bundler as well. Thanks, Colby. Greatly appreciate it. And part of what Bundler will also do is it'll create a gem file for you, which is kind of normal in most Ruby projects these days. But gem files are used for specifying dependencies. And we've already put those in our gem spec. And we don't really want to duplicate that, but that's fine because you can just add that gem spec line in there. Well, Bundler does it for you. And Bundler will then read in the dependencies from the gem spec automatically. So you only need to put them in the gem spec, not in both files. There will be situations where you may have some dependencies that only work in certain versions of Ruby or certain Ruby runtimes, and gem specs aren't that nuanced. So those kind of things you put in the gem file instead. But I find that's a very rare situation. And certainly runtime dependencies, put them in your gem spec. Okay, so that's Bundler making everything easier. Did anyone have any questions? I'm not hearing any voices or seeing any raised hands. All right, we'll keep pushing on. I realize you're probably all getting sick of my voice. Another thing that I think you should have in your gem is a code of conduct. Much like any event like this or any other professional environment, it's important to set out how you expect people to behave and how you'll treat breaches of that behavior. And open source isn't just the code, it's also the community. You know, the contributions from others, the offerings of support, fixing bugs, and so forth. So having a code of conduct is a strong step towards being clear about the industry and the community we want and that we work towards. Now, when you build a gem using Bundler, Bundler will ask you, would you like a code of conduct for it? You say yes, it's there, done. It'll always be there for any future gems that you generate. So that's a lot of the hard work done for you, easy. You may want to think about support for your gem, because certainly if other people start using the gem, they'll probably be asking you questions. And there's no obligation for you to respond, but again, none of us work in a vacuum, and our industry is built on open source software. So if you can help others, that would be wonderful. You can direct people to use GitHub issues, both to submit bug reports or to ask questions. You may want to point people to Stack Overflow, with a slightly bigger audience there generally, but also less people familiar with specific gems. So, you know, swings and roundabouts. But yeah, probably most importantly is to have a solid README. Now, writing good READMEs requires some effort. And I'm not going to go into all those details, but someone else should definitely do a talk about that. And don't be too stressed about it. Don't feel you need to cover off every single little thing. You know, try and cover the core stuff. And also recognize that a lot of gems don't get used by many people. So you're really writing the README for yourself for the most part. I've written many gems where I'm quite sure I am the only other person, or I'm the only person, there is no other person using them. It's just the way it goes. But sometimes they pick off and they kick off. And yeah, a lot of people start using them, and then you need to think about these things. Versioning is something that we've got in our gem file, and I just wanted to cover it in a little more detail. So most gems use an approach known as semantic versioning. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll give you a quick run through. Let's say this is our example version number. We've got our major version, our minor version, 0, and 1 as the patch version. And you would update each of these in different circumstances. So if all you've got is bug fixes, then a patch version is perfect, right? You're not changing any behavior. You're not adding new features. It means that anyone upgrading the gem, the worst thing that's going to happen to them is some things that were broken before are now working. That's nice. Cool. So essentially you want to indicate to other people, hey, you really do not need to stress about upgrading this gem. It's just a patch release. Go for your life. Now, if you're adding some new features in, but you're not breaking the existing behavior, you're not changing how what people need to do to use your gem, then a minor release is fine. You know, it's a bit of a bigger deal, but again, it shouldn't break anything that people are doing. No behavioral changes, just maybe some new things. Major releases, well, that's where things can change far more dramatically. If I was upgrading somebody else's gem and it went from like 6 to 7, I'd be looking at their changelog, I'd be looking at their README and going, okay, what has changed? What do I need to change so my code still works using this gem? So yeah, when you spell it out like that, it kind of feels a bit simple, but it can require some thought, some planning, particularly if your gem is a little more popular. Just so other users are prepared for what happens. But also, particularly if your gem isn't that popular, don't sweat it too much. Try and do these things for sure, but nobody's perfect. This is the goal. You know, don't give yourself a hard time if it doesn't quite go to plan. Okay, so I've talked a lot about what that looks like in some vague sense, but some real world examples would be excellent. And you can find most gems on GitHub. So that's a great place to start. But even better is the bundle open command. So within any project that you've got, you can type bundle open and then the name of gem that's used in that gem file, and it will open up the code for that gem in your favorite text editor. And so you can actually look right there at the code of how these other gems are doing things. And that's a great way to get your head around different approaches for different things within gems, or just reading some other people's code to get some inspiration, or to debug. It's up to you. All right. So we've covered off how to build gems, I think, reasonably well. But I just quickly want to go through a couple of things around writing gems that use Rails. But before I do that, I'll pause again for questions, if anyone's got them. Nope. All right, we'll keep pushing on. I know it's been a long talk. The finish line is in sight. So 2 last sections to go. So first one, you're writing gems using Rails. That's great. You've kind of got 2 core options here. The first thing that you may have heard of before is a Rails engine. And a Rails engine is a gem that has its own Rails parts, right? So much like you would in a Rails app, and you have your app models directory, and you might have config routes.rb, db migrate. You can put those same directory structures and files in your gem. And then you create a subclass of Rails engine in your gem, like so. This is a pretty standard, simple example. And then you would require that engine file as part of loading your gem. And that means that all the Rails goodness that happens when you load a Rails app about automatically knowing that the models and controllers and whatever are available also applies to all those same folder structures in your gem. They're all picked up and available within your app. Now, you do need to be careful there about what you might name some of the things in your gem. You really want to namespace them within. You wouldn't just have a model called user in your gem, because other people may try and use your gem in Rails apps that also have a model called user. So you would namespace that. You would say, well, in this case, it's Melb Ruby : user. And you'd have to create the right tables and folder structures to match. So just avoid getting in the way of standard things. Always namespace, essentially. If you're building a gem that works with Rails but doesn't have models or controls or other like Rails parts, then what you actually need is a Railtie, which is a bit simpler than an engine. And this is if you're working with, like, say, Active Record or other gems that are part of Rails, and you want to do things that part of the boot process of a Rails app or so forth. Maybe you've got some rake tasks that you want available. And this here is a very contrived example. You don't need like any of those specific things. They're just things you can do within the definition of a Railtie. Yeah, I don't have many gems that have Railties. I find it's a relatively rare thing. But yeah, once you've defined that Railtie, you want to make sure that you load it when your gem is loaded as well. Yeah, okay. One more section to go, which is really just my random grab bag of advice. Some of these are very much recommendations. Others are just my very strongly held personal opinions. This one I feel is much more the former. Don't change how Ruby behaves. Don't monkey patch Ruby. Don't change how any of the core classes, modules, methods work. I see your comment, Ryan, thanks. Yeah, like it may seem useful, it may seem cool, and it's fun to play with, as some of us saw Elliot's great work around, was it making Ruby behave like, no, writing Ruby like Elixir or something like that at the last Rails camp, which was hilarious, but you wouldn't put it in production, please. So yeah, don't change how Ruby works. And ideally don't change how Rails works either. With some of my gems, occasionally I get support requests because they're also using it with this other gem, and that gem is doing things that is changing how Rails behaves, and my gem wasn't expecting that, and it gets really confusing and hard to maintain. So please try and keep out of the Rails internals as much as possible, especially Active Record. Active Record is a headache and a half. And in a similar vein, try and use fewer modules. Now, that's such a vague recommendation, and it really is more contextual than that. I often see modules used as a way to include behavior into already large classes, right? So you're including modules into models and controllers, and they already have so much going on internally. So ideally, try and keep your logic out of that. Don't include modules in. Maybe have like one method included in which does everything else in separate classes, right? So it's not actually mucking around in the internals of those original classes. It's doing its own thing. And I'll admit that my preference here isn't necessarily the Rails way of doing things. I'm happy to talk through examples of that one-on-one with anyone. If you want to look at an example that I'm reasonably happy with, I have a gem called Guten Tag. It's a library for adding tag associations to models. I really like the name. I really like my code for the most part. Yeah, go check out that code if you want to look at a different way of doing things rather than using modules to add a whole bunch of logic in. If you're writing a gem that has a lot of dependencies and you want to support different versions of those dependencies, say different versions of Rails, there's a gem called Appraisal, which is great for that purpose. It essentially generates multiple gem files, and then you can run your test suite on each of those. I use it in a bunch of my projects. I think it's great. And David Allan, no relation, who works at Zendesk here in Melbourne, spoke about this, about Appraisal specifically 2 months ago, I think. And hopefully that talk is online. So I'm not going to go into any more detail about it. You should go watch his talk. And if you've got questions, feel free to ask me or him or the internet. Use continuous integration, use testing services so that you know that each change to your gem is working. And a lot of CI services out there support open source things for free. So Travis CI does, Circle CI does, maybe the new GitHub Actions. BuildKite, I think, does, but you need to provide your own infrastructure. Yeah, so, you know, that all happens for free. It's a little bit of a hassle to set up, but once you've done that, it's going to be super helpful. It's going to make you feel much more comfortable about pushing new releases of your gems out into the world. One final point is that if you're writing a gem that uses Rails, and particularly maybe it's a Rails engine, then use Combustion to help you test that. This is entirely self-promotion. I wrote Combustion. I use it in a lot of my gems. I think it's great. So feel free to give that a shot. And if you've got questions, you can come ask me. So that is pretty much all I had to say. I hope it's been informative. It seems everyone's stuck around, which is very nice of you all. If you have questions later on, feel free, like just about gems generally, you're welcome to ask me in Slack or on Twitter. I'll put these slides up online. We're going to put the video up online. Yeah. Also, I've just realized my Zoom things have been hanging over on my other window. Hopefully they weren't in the way. Oh, well, I'll put the slides up online anyway. That'll help. Thank you for sticking through all of this with me all the way to the end. And massive thank you also to Celia, Vanessa, and Ryan for making sure this meeting still took place, right? With all the lockdown and the social distancing stuff and all these new challenges, they could have just said, nah, sorry, not happening. We'll come back later. But they didn't. they put in the hard yards to make this happen, and I really appreciate that. It's an amazing effort. Thank you. And that's me. I'm done. Stop sharing my screen. Where am I doing this? There we go. Okay. Celia and Vanessa, I don't know if you want to take over things now. You're muted.
Hello, thank you so much, Pat. That was delightful.
It was great.
Equally as good the second time round. I think I will now remember what chmod actually means. I've been trying for a while. I use it all the time, and now I'm going to remember what it stands for. It's good. I'm excited. Talk videos are up there. They're mostly up to date now. If there's something missing at this stage, unfortunately, that means it wasn't recorded, and we're very sorry. But at the moment, they are pretty much up to date, which is cool. If you have a talk that you would like to give, especially if you would like to give one online, because that's where we are, at least for April, we're not sure for how long.
Don't we have someone for April? We potentially have someone for April, but they signed up for in person.
So we need to chat with them and make sure this is okay with them. Pat very kindly agreed to be our first person who is presenting online. So thank you, Pat.
It's amazing. It's really hard to just like talk into the ether and not kind of get a lot of feedback. Yeah. So that was amazing. Thank you.
It was a little unnerving. Yeah. But yeah, it went, I'm happy with how it all went. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great.
It's very, very cool.
Equally, if you, we click here. If you want to see a talk, tech is hard. Oh wait, is this being recorded? If you want to see a talk, you can also do the same thing. Request it on GitHub. Yes. Talk to Ryan, me, or Ness. Next, I already put a picture of today's pizza in the Slack channel, but this is like the pizza that Ellie and Lachlan taught me how to make. I'm so excited. There's been so much pizza in the last week.
It's really delicious. Thanks, Ellie and Lachlan. It's quite exceptional pizza.
Yeah.
That you have taught Celia to make.
And that brings us to the end of the proceedings. Our post meetup festivities will be at home at your place. Or at home at your place.
I really enjoy the dress code at my place.
We'll leave the Zoom call open, but we'll stop screen sharing. If you do want to keep chatting, do. And thank you all very much for popping in and chatting and staying. We had, I think 42 was the most people we had tonight, which is phenomenal. And I'm the worst for forgetting to check in with my fabulous technical friends online. So thank you all for chatting and coming, and we'll hang out now. That's it. I think I'm going to mute us now. No one can talk.
Great job, everyone.
That is quite a setup, Ryan. That's phenomenal.
You're about the 8th person to comment on it today. Somebody said that I looked like I was running the drive time program from a radio studio.
Yes, accurate.
Ryan, you could become the new